the presentation now?
Yes, sir. It's just loaded. It's on.
All right, excellent. Okay, so the bulk of my talk today is going to be about a history of sea turtle conservation in India. Um, but as Dr. Devi Prasad said, I have worked on many taxa in the last 10, 15 years in what I call my day job in IISc. And much of that really actually has been centered on peninsular India and the Western Ghats, on terrestrial taxa. And I thought I would just sort of briefly touch upon that, since many of you here are students and will potentially have an interest in some of that work. So a large part of our work in the Western Ghats has been centered around what I refer to as two detective stories. And these two detective stories are what we call the Linnaean shortfall, which is the lack of knowledge of taxonomy, or of all of the species that exist. And this is fairly well known publicly. When new species get described, it gets a lot of attention in newspapers and so on. But what is a little less known, and what is equally important for our understanding of ecology, biogeography, and conservation, is what we call the Wallacean shortfall, which is a lack of knowledge of where these species are found, or the distribution of species. So much of the work in our lab over the last 15 years has focused on resolving both the Linnaean and the Wallacean shortfall towards answering questions of both evolution and biogeography, as well as making contributions to conservation prioritization. And one of the ways in which that we've done this is over that 10, 12-year period, we actually undertook a sampling of the Western Ghats in a very systematic fashion, what we call a biogeographically informed framework, by sampling each of the peaks and massives, and capturing the topographic, bioclimatic, and geological heterogeneity across all of the elevational gradients over this period. And this, of course, is not a single project. It's been it's several different projects and multiple PhD students, researchers, and postdocs. And while I won't go into sort of some of the more evolutionary biogeographic results, I just thought I'd share some quick, the exciting findings in terms of at least the species discoveries. My student Vijay Kumar a few years ago described 9 species of bush frogs, Raucestus, and this is the largest known vertebrate radiation in the Western Ghats at this point. Also, from an evolutionary biogeographic point of view, he found that the Palghat Gap, which was very well known to separate recent divergences such as elephants and other large mammals, we found that the Palghat Gap actually separates evolutionary clades dating back to 20 to 25 million years as well. He also, for example, found that the southern radiation is much more ecologically diverse and has species across a much larger stratum of the forest than the northern clade. So these are some of the kinds of questions that we answer with our work. Another student, Varun Torsekar, worked on Nyctibatrachus and found, again, a similarly large radiation of Nyctibatrachus. And today we believe that there are over 50 lineages in this group, making it actually the second largest vertebrate radiation. And then going from these really diverse radiations, a couple of years ago, we discovered the Astrobatrachus kurichiyana, which is a mono-specific genus. It's so far we only know one species from this, and it in fact belongs to its own subfamily, and perhaps eventually might be classified in its own family as well. So on the one hand, genera that have 60 to 70 species in them; on the other hand, a genus that has a single species in it. What causes these kinds of patterns, in biodiversity hotspots such as the Western Ghats? And then, of course, we have similar patterns with lizards. A new genus of agamid lizards from the Western Ghats. A deeply divergent genus, again with a single species of vine snake, which is ancestral to all the other vine snakes. Several new species of vine snakes, which will probably be published in the next within the next few days or weeks at the most. And I think all those, of you who've grown up with doing some herping one of the first snakes that all of us may have handled when we were, early on may have been the, vine snake, which we then learned was Ahetula nasuta. Firstly, Ahetula nasuta comprises several different species in the Western Ghats, and there's another surprise in that paper that I'm not going to reveal right now, which which was a bit heartbreaking from me, and you'll find out what that is soon enough. As well as with pit vipers and so on. The other large body of work that we do in the lab is with mixed species groups. And this is something that we worked on both birds extensively in the Western Ghats with several PhD students and master's students, in fact, from Pondicherry, from your department in Pondicherry University. And also in the last decade or so with reef fish. And I think perhaps this is, we're the only lab in the world that works on mixed species grouping in both fish as well as in birds. So a lot of fun. And I think I would definitely credit a number of my researchers and PhD students for generating the ideas that went into these projects and contributing to substantial progress in some of these fields. With mixed species grouping, for example, there's a large review paper that a lot of people in my lab were involved in, which came out a little earlier this year. So any of you who are interested in that, I would definitely recommend looking at that. Okay, so let's get back to the main story of the day and talk about turtles. And one of the projects that I have been very excited about, because it's something that I wanted to work on from the time I was a master's student and got involved with sea turtles. I wanted to go and see a leatherback. Always heard about leatherbacks as the largest sea turtle in the world, and it's a dream that eventually came true. But before we talk about tracking the leatherback, I want to briefly talk about tracking the turtle man. And Janaki Lennon and Rom Whittaker had written a small piece about him a few years back, and in it they said he doesn't like to crawl into a sleeping bag. He buries himself at night and covers himself with a mosquito net and sleeps out of sight of others after playing a few riffs on his harmonica. Sounds like a nice, strange, exotic character, and indeed he was. This is a picture of Satish Bhaskar, who in this picture you can see has draped himself with a necklace of sea crates, which I don't recommend. As they say in the ads, do not try these stunts at home. Satish was my mentor, and when I was in the last, towards the end of my bachelor's and the early part of my master's, when I was involved with starting the student sea turtle group in Chennai, Satish was already a legend, and he was taking a break between projects, and he was in Chennai and was available, was to go on turtle walks with us and mentor us. But he wasn't just my mentor; he was also the person who, in a way, laid the foundations for sea turtle biology and conservation in the country. And so, I think it's always appropriate to start with a little tribute to him. Satish was actually an engineering student in IIT Madras, and from accounts that I heard from his classmates, whom I met many years later, he spent most of his days, running to Elliot's Beach, swimming in the sea, and running back, and not attending too many classes. Again, for solidarity with the other faculty at this talk, I must say I do not recommend this to students necessarily. But fortunately for him and many others like him who were disenchanted with their subjects of study, Rom Whittaker had just started the snake park and also started turtle walks along the Madras coast. And Rom tells the story that many of these kids would bunk class, bunk college, and turn up in snake park, and they'd be hanging around looking at snakes. And he would walk up to them, and many of these early herpetologists who became stalwarts in their field said their career started with Rom walking up to them and saying, "Hey man, do you want to clean a snake pit?" This includes people like Shekhar Dattatri, who is a very well-known wildlife filmmaker, Preston Ahimas, who for many years spearheaded WWF in Chennai, Harry Andrews, who ran Crocbank for many years, and so on. The list goes on. With Satish, Rom said, we're doing crocodile surveys and snake surveys. There's no one sort of focused on sea turtles. Why don't you start working on sea turtles? And so Satish, of course, like everything else he did, took that very seriously and started out actually his work with a trip to the Gulf of Mannar. Wrote a lovely short note about it in Hammer Drag. And the following year was encouraged, in fact, by the then director of CMFRI, E.G. Silas, who also sort of pioneered sea turtle conservation through the state agencies for the very first time, to undertake a survey of Suheli. Suheli is a remote island in the Lakshadweep, about 8 hours by boat from Kavaratti, the capital. And the fishermen do not only visit during the good season for fishing, and actually during the monsoons, they don't go there at all. The problem was that the green turtles nest there during the monsoon, and so Satish had to plan his trip to the islands during the monsoon. So he decided that he would be dropped off by a fishing boat, spent 5 months on Suheli, and went there with all his rations and everything, and was prepared to stay there for 5 months entirely on his own without a single other human being. Now, you might wonder how he communicated back with people. Of course, there were no cell phones or satellite phones or anything of that sort. So Satish used to swim out onto the reef and put a note in a bottle along with a 1 rupee note or a 5 rupee note in it, and throw it out in the hope that it would reach someone. He says that he did this several times, and eventually one bottle actually got caught a current and made it to Sri Lanka, where a kind fisherman put it in an envelope and mailed it to his wife. It traveled a distance of about 500 miles in 24 days, and the letter actually reached his wife within a month, which is quite remarkable, I think, even by today's standards. Satish completed his survey of Suheli. The amazing thing is that the boat that was supposed to pick him up came 1 month late. Fortunately, he had enough provisions and so on. He says that the biggest problem he encountered was that a whale died and washed up on one corner of the island and then began to stink. And so basically he had to move his entire camp to the other end of the island and couldn't go anywhere near that part of the island for several weeks. We visited Suheli. I finally got to go there in 2015. And even in 2015, it took us several weeks of planning. We had to organize 2 fishing boats. It took us 8 hours to get there by boat. We camped there for 3 days, surveyed some dives offshore, and came back. It's a beautiful, pristine pair of islands, and currently is threatened by some prospect of development into resorts by large companies, which local groups and conservation groups have been trying to oppose. But I tell that just to highlight how challenging it must have been for him and how intrepid this man was to go there and spend 5 months in 1979, when even now to do something like that would be very difficult, even though there is now a little police checkpost and so on over there. Inspired by this, Satish then went to the Andaman Island, and as Rom says, got hooked. Remarkably, in the beginning of his 1979 report, he says, in the interest of brevity, it will be better to list the areas and islands not surveyed. And he surveyed most of the islands in the 70s, and what he didn't survey in that period, he then went on to survey in the early 80s. So Satish created baselines for almost all of the islands of India, and then over the next few years, also the Gujarat coast, the Orissa coast, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and so on. So Satish single-handedly surveyed almost the entire coast of India by the mid-80s. He also had some spectacular adventures. In Interview Island, he was chased by an elephant, and on Interview Island, where these feral elephants had been released, and then he had taken his shirt off and thrown it to distract it, and the next day he swam back from South Reef Island, where he was camped to monitor hawksbills, and found his shirt in pieces and very reassuringly posted it back to his wife. Another time he came across a green turtle that had been freshly roasted by a party of Onges in Little Andamans. He writes beautifully about it. And then he was really hungry, so he ate it. And then he left 2 biscuit packets for them, he says, to salve his conscience. I would imagine that the Onges would have been even more angry at finding biscuit packets in exchange for their green turtle meat. That's Satish in a picture with Ram and some of their early field assistants. The other remarkable story about Satish is one of the first people to visit West Papua as a project for WWF, and he worked at Jamusba Medi and Varmon, which are these really remote beaches that, again, when I visited in 2005, it took us 8 hours by boat, and then getting, actually accessing the beach through the boat and getting back to the boat were all like still challenges 20 years later. He was one of the first outsiders to actually visit some of these villages and work there. And he single-handedly counted about 13,000 leatherbacks and tagged many of them. And a few years later, the population declined. And so the locals had come up with this story that this man had come and fitted these tags on these turtles, and then he had gone back to his country and used this giant magnet to attract all the turtles back, to his home. Throughout his career, so as I mentioned before, he pretty much traveled across all of India as well as parts of Indonesia, and provided these incredible baselines and inspired this interest in sea turtles that many people followed after him, and sort of really led to the establishment of sea turtle biology as well as conservation in India. Harry Andrews and the Madras Crocodile Bank established a monitoring program in Galathea, which Satish had first surveyed in 91, along with actually Manjula Tiwari, who was a student of. She's from Pondicherry. I don't think she was a student of Pondicherry University, but she is from Pondicherry, and she was one of the first women herpetologists.
She was for 1 year. She was for 1 year.
She left, right? Yeah. I remember now. Yeah. So Manjula was the first woman. I would say probably the first woman to be involved in sea turtle biology in India. She was one of the first people to survey the Nicobar Islands after Satish. And her survey, she went on one survey alone actually first, and then with Satish, and they established Galathea as one of the main nesting beaches for leatherbacks in India. And based on that, Harry Andrews started a leatherback monitoring camp in 2000. I was there in 2001, 2002 as part of my postdoc with WII, and collecting samples for a genetic analysis. And then Harry and I were able to sort of raise funds to keep that monitoring camp going. Sadly, in 2004, the tsunami struck. Our researcher, Ambika Tripathi, who was working there, died, and also several visiting bird watchers, all of the field staff camp, the forest department staff, and so on. One remarkable outcome of the story is that the water receded, and the researchers started going out into the water to see what was happening, and then the water started coming in. It was too late for them to they were trying to run away to a nearby hill, but then a 10-15 meter wave hit them, and they were all sort of swept away. How do we know the story though? Our field assistant Agu was at the camp and was with them, and in fact was when the water receded, he felt that there was going to be a large wave, and he was trying to get them to run to safety. Eventually, though, when the larger wave hit, Agu managed to hold on to a tree and hold his breath for long enough. And when he surfaced, he had been swept far out into the bay, had broken several ribs and his collarbones, and couldn't swim back. And so he hung onto that log for 9 days without food or water. And then when a monitor lizard climbed the log and started to eat him, basically he then gathered up whatever strength he had left and managed to swim back to land, and was rescued after 16 days. Quite an incredible story, which he is told in an issue of Current Conservation many years ago, if you want to read the full account. Just 2 years later, Agu and Uncle Pao went out with Manish Chandy and me to Little Andaman Island. We had by then decided that we could not re-establish the camp in Galatia because it was logistically too challenging. The beach had reformed on the other side of the river, and so we were surveying these beaches in Little Andamans, and Agu was back in the field with us. Uncle Pao himself is quite a figure in the history of faunal surveys in the islands. He was working with Ram and Satish on crocodile and turtle surveys from the 70s. This was in fact his last field trip, and we established the camp at South Bay and Little Bay, where we've been monitoring leatherback since 2008. What we also do is, this is our camp in Little Andamans. What we've also been doing is tracking them using satellite transmitters. We tracked 10 turtles between 2011 and 2015. The first 7 or 8 turtles all went east towards Western Australia, which is what people thought they did. But just at the point when we thought we knew what they were doing, the last 2 turtles that we tagged went to Mozambique and Madagascar. So the turtles that nest in the Andamans are pretty much using the entire Indian Ocean for foraging, to migrate and to forage. So coming back from, backtracking a little bit from tracking the turtle man and tracking the leatherback, just a brief account of sea turtles as a whole. A classic book by Archie Carr, who's considered the father of sea turtle biology and conservation, is titled "So Excellent a Fish," and I certainly recommend that. And this phrase comes from an act against killing of they call it our young tortoises in the Bermuda Assembly of 1620, which possibly is the first conservation law protecting sea turtles in the world. For a small number of species, sea turtles attract a large amount of attention. There's just 7 species belonging to 2 families, of which 5 are found globally, and the Kempsridley only in Mexico, and the Australian flatback, no points for guessing, only in Australia. But the ratio of biologists or conservationists to species is probably one of the highest for this group. The International Sea Turtle Symposium, for example, attracts more than 1,000 people. So I'm always sort of struck by how much attention this small group attracts. But they've also fascinated biologists and conservationists for decades because of their fascinating life histories. Loggerheads have the longest breeding migrations, traveling 10 to 15,000 kilometers. All sea turtle species migrate thousands of kilometers to breed. Leatherbacks are amongst the deepest diving air-breathing vertebrates, along with sperm whales and elephant seals. They're known to dive to over 500 meters on a regular basis, perhaps even over 1,000 meters. Green turtles, loggerheads, hawksbills are known to hybridize, which again is pretty remarkable given how ancient their separation is. And ridleys, which we're going to talk about, are known for their enormous nesting aggregates. And of course, there is the idea of precision of natal homing, and there have even been rumors of loggerhead populations that hibernated underwater. Some images of the common species. Leatherbacks, the largest. Hawksbills, remarkable because they're amongst the few animals that are sponge feeders, that are spongivorous. Green turtles, ubiquitous. They were known as the soup turtle for many years because they provided meat and nutrition to communities worldwide, as well as to sailors around the world. And of course, olive ridleys, which attract the most attention in India. Very briefly, a turtle's life cycle consists of starts with a large-scale breeding migration, which can be from 1,000 to 10,000 kilometers from feeding to breeding ground. As mentioned, they will nest. They have what is called philopatry, which is nesting in the region where they were born. The precision of this can vary from species to species and population to population. Species that nest on small islands, obviously, if you miss the island, you've lost your chance to reproduce. So you've got to be pretty precise to survive, or rather, only the ones who are precise survive. On the mainland, you can afford to make some error, and so populations along the east coast of India, we have not found any genetic differences, and so probably those a sea turtle that's born on a hatchling that's born in Orissa might nest might grow up and nest in Andhra, Tamil Nadu as an adult, possibly, but not in an entirely different region. They mate in offshore waters. They nest usually at night on sandy beaches. Hatchlings incubate for about 8 to 10 weeks. Sex is determined by temperature. Hatchlings find the sea using light cues and then follow a pelagic lifestyle for 10 to 15 to maybe 30 to 40 years even for green turtles. And they navigate using the Earth's magnetic field. One of the crucial aspects of their life cycle is their incubation temperature, which in sea turtles, which is opposite of crocodiles, higher temperatures produce females. And sex ratio is likely to vary over the course of a nesting season and between nesting beaches. But the critical thing in the context of climate change is that if sex ratios increase, then you're likely to produce more and more females, which will have impacts on the population. The other aspect that leads to potential threat is that sea finding is primarily visual in hatchlings, and therefore any form of lighting, which is very widespread on beaches across the world, can result in misorientation and the death of hatchlings. I'll just take one short break, and I'll be back with you in a second.
Sure, sir. In the meantime, if any of the participants want to take the time and type your questions in the chat box, you can do that. By the time sir comes back, you can leave your questions in the chat box.
Cool. I'm back. The challenges of home are that you have to there are all kinds of sounds and.
No problem, sir. Thank you.
Okay, where were we? All right. So coming back to olive ridleys, all of you will know that Orissa is really well known for its mass nesting beaches and the olive ridley arribadas over there. I had heard about it from the time I started working on turtles when I was as a undergraduate in Madras Christian College, and the dream was to go and see an arribada. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I actually took a break from sea turtles and did my PhD on small mammal community ecology. And for 6 years, I didn't think about 6 or 7 years, I didn't think about turtles at all. So it was a good 10 years from my Chennai Turtle Walk days when I finally started a postdoc. I was very excited, and I went out to Orissa. And the entire time I was at Ghayar Mata, there was no arribada over there. So then I moved on with my work to Devi and then finally to Rushikulya. And of course, things will always happen this way. By the time I went to Rushikulya, the arribada had started in Ghayar Mata. And so, of course, a bunch of us got into a jeep, and it took us 2 days to get there, but we finally got there and I was able to see my first mass nesting event, which is truly a spectacular experience, and I recommend that to everyone. Now, people have known about these arribadas actually for a very long time. In fact, a book written by a ship's captain in 1777 talks about these prodigious numbers of sea tortoises off the coast of Balasore, which is northern Orissa. But and local communities also use the eggs. But scientists discovered it officially when Robert Bustard, who was a Scotsman who was working in Australia, came to India for a crocodile survey and visited Bhitarkanika's sanctuary and discovered the Ghayar Mata beach. He then encouraged a number of youngsters to get involved in sea turtle research and conservation. One of them was B.C. Chowdhury, who was my postdoctoral advisor at Wildlife Institute of India. Another was Chandrasekhar Kar, who did his PhD on sea turtles in Ghayar Mata under Bustard's mentorship, and in fact discovered the second rookery at Devi River mouth in 1982. In 1994, another B.C. Chowdhury student, Devash Pandav, discovered a third rookery at Rushikulya. Um, Now, the work that I did in the late 90s, when I returned to sea turtle research, was on ridley genetics. And what was known about ridleys at the time was that between the Kemp's ridley and the olive ridley, one was distributed only in Mexico, the others had large nesting aggregates in Pacific Mexico, Costa Rica, and Orissa on the east coast of India. And what had been hypothesized was that when the Isthmus of Panama formed, separating, joining the Americas and separating the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, the Atlantic population became the Kemp's and the Pacific population became the olive ridley. In fact, it was known as the olive Pacific ridley in many accounts. Now, what this would mean is that you would expect the two populations, I'm not sure if you can see the cursor, this one and this one, to be most closely genetically related. A study done a couple of years before had provided some hints that that might not be in fact the case. This was research by Brian Bowen, who pioneered a lot of the phylogeographic work across many, many species of sea turtles, and also mentored some of my early work. And what we found, in fact, was quite remarkable. I'm not showing you the tree, but we actually confirmed Bowen's results that the phylogenetically or phylogeographically, the population on the east coast of India was the closest relative of Kemp's ridleys. Now, how might this have come about? Now, the geological record actually showed that climatic changes began even earlier than the closure of Isthmus of Panama. There was an effect of the closure of the Indonesian Seaway. What all of this resulted in was that the northern Atlantic and the Indian Ocean became warmer about 4 million years ago, which means that it's quite possible that the ridley populations globally died out, leaving only these remnant populations in the Indian Ocean and the northern Atlantic, which too then diverged into two different species of ridleys. And there was a subsequent colonization of the Atlantic and Pacific about 300,000 years ago, which again we were able to infer using genetic data. From that perspective, the olive ridleys in the Indian Ocean, particularly on the east coast of India, where the largest populations are likely to be the evolutionary source or the origin of ridleys worldwide. All the more reason to study them, as people have been doing for the last 20 years. We've studied them on shore and at sea. The in-water work began with Vivash Pandav's PhD research. Prior to that, Chandrasekhar Kar, who I mentioned, had tagged thousands of nesting turtles, but Vivash was the first one to tag them out at sea. He tagged over 1,600 mating pairs, which they caught using specialized sort of fishing net that is field assistance devised. With this, they were able to detect interbeach movement of these turtles. That is, that the same turtles were found in different nesting beaches in Orissa, and also got a number of long-distance tag returns, which indicated that many of these turtles were migrating to Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu. In the early 2000s, we were all involved in a satellite telemetry project which tagged only 4 turtles at the time, of which one traveled to Sri Lanka, proving that point. But several also remained in the offshore waters of Orissa. A subsequent work by Wildlife Institute showed that this pattern was largely true, that many turtles did migrate to Gulf of Mannar and Sri Lanka, and many remain in the offshore waters. The difference, of course, being that during the breeding season, they're within, they're very close to the coast, within 5 kilometers, whereas on the non-breeding season, they can be even 100 to 200 kilometers offshore. Now, this offshore work also showed that these turtles occupy these very small breeding areas of 50 to 75 kilometers, and this was very relevant in the context of, the protected area that had been declared Gahirmata Marine Sanctuary is almost 1,400 square kilometers, whereas these turtles were only occupying this area of about 50 square kilometers, and suggesting that if those areas were patrolled, then one could protect these turtles, and it wasn't actually necessary to either have to patrol much larger areas, or also that those areas didn't have to be prohibited in terms of fishing and so on. Unfortunately, Uh, while the idea that these reproductive patches has been internalized in policy, the idea that these patches are not static and may vary, and that they occupy kind of very discrete small zones, has not quite made it into policy. So for the last 10 years, 12 years, we have been monitoring reproductive patches in Rushikulya. And the takeaway from this figure is that as we monitor them multiple times within a season and then across seasons, and we find that the patches actually vary in size and shape and location, both within and between seasons. And so having one static area where where you draw a line and say this will be a protected area for sea turtles during the breeding season will not really work, and it has to be sensitive to where those turtles actually are each season and within each season as well. The other question that one is always asked is, are these? In fact, one assumes, in fact, when people talk to that these turtle populations are declining because that is the narrative we have read in newspapers. And for the longest time, Gahir Mata was touted as the world's largest rookery, which of course it is not. There's a much larger nesting rookeries in both Mexico as well as in Costa Rica. The work that we did in the early 2000s seemed to suggest that these populations are declining. And we had written a paper which said that the trends show possibility of a sharp decline. There's a failure of arribada in many years, high levels of mortality, over 10 to 15,000 turtles being killed each year, unpredictability of arribadas in size and timing and location. And based on Vivash Pandav's data, we've also detected a decline in adult breeding size, which led us to conclude that a sharp decline in the population was imminent. Now, we started monitoring in Rushikulya in 2007. That year there was no arribada, and the following years we found about 70,000 turtles, which was in the range of about 25 to 50, not much more than the 25 to 50,000 turtles that Vivash Pandav, Basudev Tripathi, and others had recorded over from the late 90s to the mid 2000s. But as we continued our monitoring, we found that in some years like 2011 and 2013, the numbers were well over 100,000. And in 2017 and 18, we recorded between 250 and 400,000 turtles on that beach, and exceptionally high hatching successes. And so our long-term monitoring of the site seemed to indicate that these populations are not declining the way that the popular narrative might suggest. We've also been monitoring sex ratios, which, of course, as you can see, there is a possibility that increasing temperatures might be leading to highly female-biased sex ratios. But this work is still in progress, and I would be hesitant to conclude too much on the basis of that. At first glance, you might think those are turtle hatchlings. Those are not. That's the aftermath of an arribada in 2015. An arribada in which we had recorded over 100,000 turtles, and this is what it looks like on the beach. This is actually from 2013 on a night on which we recorded 60,000 turtles. So in 2020, if you ask me now, I would say arribadas are occurring at multiple sites on a very regular basis. Probably, not even perhaps, I would say definitely increasing in Rushikulya. Fishing mortality may have decreased a little bit, may not have increased, but even if it's constant, it certainly doesn't seem to be impacting this population. Adult breeding sizes have certainly not declined further. At best, my conclusion would be that this population is for now stable or increasing. It also brings to mind what sea turtle veteran biologist and conservationist Jack Frazier has said repeatedly through his career. He says, there is no such thing as a sea turtle expert. Every time you think you know what sea turtles are doing, they prove you wrong. So to echo him, I would say we still really don't know enough about these turtles. However, having said that, if we think about the conservation of sea turtles, it has an equally interesting history. Prior to independence, there was a lot of egg collection, including after independence with licensing from the Forest Department. They were transported to Calcutta. Turtles were transported by train for a long time. This was eventually, the egg take was eventually halted after Bustard suggested a temporary stay on take of eggs until they could evaluate the population trend, but eventually it got completely banned. In 1972, India passed the Wildlife Protection Act. In 1977, sea turtles were added to it. But in the meantime, the mechanization of fishing meant that the take of turtles for the meat market in Calcutta, and many people who grew up there, herpetologists like Indraneel Das, say that when they were children and they went out to these beaches, there would be sea turtles out there as well. Now, just checking the connection. Are we still connected? Yes. All right. Great. Cool. And so it went from.
Sir,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but did you stop presenting because we can't see the presentation?
Again now?
No, sir. We were able to see until like a minute ago.
Okay. Hang on a second. Let me just, because I thought the power went, so just cross-checking that. Yeah. Is it back?
Yes, sir. It's back.
Awesome. So what was a few thousand turtles, and that everybody in Calcutta enjoyed, getting turtle meat during the season, including Bengali Brahmins, because of course, as far as they are concerned, fish was perfectly. Fish is vegetarian. Fish are the fruit of the sea, and then turtles are also classified as considered as fish. So everybody would eat turtles. No problem. I don't think it had any effect on the population at all. However, when mechanization started, this take went up from a few thousands to tens of thousands, and some estimates say that in the late 70s, during some years, 50 to 80,000 turtles were transported by truck and by rail every year, and by fishing boat. So a huge take of turtles from this population. I'll digress a minute to say that in Baja California and Mexico as well, the Catholic fishermen would consider turtles as fish. So during the month of Lent, when they weren't allowed to eat meat, they would eat. The turtle consumption would go up. So a friend of mine and a conservationist who worked there, Jay Nichols, in the early 2000s, he was working with the community and trying to persuade them, not to, eat turtle meat in such large quantities. He wrote a letter to the Vatican suggesting that the church decree that by zoological classification, turtles are reptiles and not fish, and he hoped that might lead to the reduction of consumption in Baja California. He got a letter from the Vatican saying that they had received his letter and that it was under consideration. I think that was the last he heard from them. But his efforts with the communities in Baja California eventually did lead to the decline in turtle take there. In Orissa, on the other hand, the forest, there was a number of interventions. Chandrasekhar Kar, who I mentioned, J. Vijaya, who was again one of India's earliest women herpetologists. She rediscovered the forest cane turtle, which was later renamed after her. It's now called Vijayacalis sylvatica. Her visits to Orissa, her article about the turtle take over there, her photographs, which were published in India Today, eventually caught the attention of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. This led to the enforcement by Coast Guard and the Forest Department. In fact, while I was doing research for my book, I talked to the Secretary of Environment, who was the person who was the Secretary of Environment in the 1980s when this happened, Samar Singh, and he actually remembers getting a phone call from the Prime Minister's office saying that the Prime Minister wants you to look into this particular matter, and she had written a note on a newspaper clipping about this turtle mortality issue, saying who's keeping an eagle's eye on this matter. Several international letter writing campaigns were also prominent at the time. Archie Carr wrote a letter to Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. She replied to him, and that was published in the Marine Turtle newsletter. The editor of Marine Turtle newsletter, Nicholas Rozovsky, wrote several editorials and encouraged people to write to the Indian government. All of this sort of led to central government interest in this issue, and Samar Singh says he was asked to go to the Ministry of Defense and ask the Coast Guard to patrol the waters, and of course the minister, called him and shouted at him saying, he'd never heard of sea turtles obviously in his life, and he said this is not what the armed forces are for. But when he discovered that this is something the Prime Minister wanted, then of course the Coast Guard was deployed. The intentional take of turtles over the next 4 or 5 years by the mid-80s had completely declined. There are probably still some clandestine sale of turtle meat, but this hardly has any effect on the population. What happened, however, was that the increase in the trawl industry by the late 80s and the early 90s had led to a significant increase in incidental catch. Since the 90s, I would guess that over 200,000 dead turtles have washed up along the Orissa coast or more. This in the late 90s and early 2000s led to a lot of conservationist campaigns, and the Forest Department attempted to enforce the no fishing law. Conservation groups were demonizing by fishermen with lots of outreach programs, media campaigns. There were a lot of newspaper articles saying trawlers murder innocent turtles and so on. And this was very prominent in the early 2000s, and it still happens. What it basically meant was that there was a big rift between fishermen and conservationists, and the ongoing protests also sort of took a deadly turn in 2003. The trawler owners fishermen took a forest guard hostage and threw him overboard, and he died. A few years later, the forest guards opened fire on a fishing boat, killing one fisherman, and there were obviously lots of huge protests and about all of this, justifiably so. Now, part of the problem was that this was a perverse implementation of a fisheries law. The law that they were trying to implement was actually intended to protect artisanal fishers. It said that mechanized fishers must fish beyond a certain limit. And if it had been implemented to protect local fishermen, it would have had a very different political impact. But because it was promoted as being turtle conservation, it succeeded in alienating all fishermen. It also led to rhetoric and campaigns from all sides. The trawler owners, like in any good murder mystery, when there's, in any murder mystery, there's a dead body, and if you ask the prime culprit, their first response is, I didn't do it. So they also then, of course, have created their own narrative around this. They said that mass mortality must be because of pollution. It's a logical enough argument, but not true in this case, obviously. But they began to get more and more creative. They said it must be migration fatigue. Well, we know that turtles have migrated thousands of kilometers for thousands and thousands of years, but all of a sudden now they're getting tired and dying. But the best one was labor pain. They said that turtles are dying because of labor pain, and in fact, a trawler owner president, or the association president, actually one time at a workshop, he took me aside and he said, I was by my wife's side when she had one child. Imagine what pain a turtle goes through when it lays 100 eggs. Even tears come out of its eyes. That's why they die. I'm pretty sure that they knew that these latter reasons were not true, and that they were making it up as a counter campaign. But I think that what was more underlying this was that they were claiming that there was unfair targeting of only one of the causes of turtle mortality. Why aren't you doing anything about coastal development, about pollution, about industry, and so on? And this is actually something that fishermen in Australia and the US had also said, and it's quite justified. There was anger at both Forest Department and conservationists. And this is a situation that we try to resolve and haven't actually resolved, but we set up the Orissa Marine Resources Conservation Consortium to bring together fishers, conservationists, and others in the mid-2000s, and to resolve fishery-related bycatch through dialogue. And also to point out that coastal development, such as oil exploration, development of ports, etc., pose a much, much bigger threat in the sense that even if 10,000 turtles die, 20,000 turtles die, a population can recover, as they seem actually to have done. On the other hand, if you lose your nesting beaches, then you are going to lose these populations forever. One of these came up in the context of what I call the Dhamra Wars, which was, depending on which generation you're from, you will recognize one of these posters. And this was over the construction of a port in Dhamra, which has now been completed. In the 2007-2008, we were part of a long sort of battle over this. And what was again very interesting about it was that that even though you would imagine that there is a good side and a bad side, there's like the port company who wants to build the port, and then there are the conservationists and the state agencies and the scientists would all be on the same side. Actually, it was quite confusing. Everybody wanted to use science, but everybody wanted the science to show something different. The NGOs wanted the science to show that there are sea turtles in the shipping routes. Port companies wanted the science to show that sea turtles will not become extinct. Both are true. IUCN wanted to show that science can be a bridge between corporations and conservation. The state, of course, I would say rarely acknowledges science, but in another sense, they also they want their decisions to be based on science. The long story short over there, of course, is that IUCN was contracted by the Tatas or the Dhamra Port Trust to help them plan mitigation activities. The port construction went ahead, and in the course of that 2 or 3 years, every alignment between NGOs, state, NGO company, you could see all the different sort of permutations and combinations, making it actually quite a fascinating episode. I will round this out by talking about, I've talked primarily about olive ridleys in Orissa and a little bit about leatherbacks, but the work that Satish initiated actually started with these turtle walks that I mentioned. While Bustard was initiating a research program in Orissa, Ram Whitaker and others were starting sea turtle monitoring. They did some surveys of the fishery in Tuticorin. But I think most importantly, they started these turtle walks as a civil society movement. Their first hatchery was in a friend's backyard. And while it was run by the Madras Snake Park Trust, CMFRI and WWF would conduct turtle walks with students, it remained largely a citizen sort of initiative. Even when the Forest Department was running hatcheries, WWF would actually conduct walks with students and citizens, and they would collect eggs and take them to the hatchery. So there was always a citizen involvement. And when the Forest Department decided to close down its hatcheries, some of us were in Chennai. We'd go on turtle walks, and along with a couple of seniors of mine from the Department of Zoology in Madras Christian College, and a couple of others, 4 or 5 of us decided to start the Student Sea Turtle Conservation Network, which we thought might be active for 1, 2, 3, 4 years until we left and moved on to other things. And so it's actually a great in a way, a surprise, but remarkably satisfying that it's been active actually for over 30 years now. The success of the SSTCN and I think the general appeal of working with sea turtles has led to sea turtle conservation groups in pretty much every state from across the society. So fishermen in Kerala, school teachers and school groups in Kerala, fishing youth in Tamil Nadu and Andhra led by the Tree Foundation, animal welfare activists, other citizen science groups, some started by Forest Department staff, many community groups in Orissa, which started by people that worked as field assistants with either Bivash Pandav or with us or with other conservation programs in Orissa. So a remarkable cross-section, diversity of society that's become involved in conserving sea turtles across the country, and in fact across the world. The Sea Turtles Symposium, which I mentioned, probably attracts people from more countries than any other such international conference for such a small group of species. There's 70 to 80 countries worldwide where there are sea turtle conservation programs of one sort or another. And we bring these groups together within India through what we call the Turtle Action Group. But in closing, I'd like to say that it's really important that we recognize that sea turtles as attractive as they are, as charismatic, as iconic, sea turtles are only flagships. I used a passing phrase. I said that in Orissa, from flagships, they become battleships. So from being this species who we were using to promote conservation, sea turtles were actually beginning to alienate communities from conservation. Now, this has happened in Orissa, this has happened in Lakshadweep as well, because in Lakshadweep, rising green turtle populations have destroyed seagrass meadows, which has reduced bait fish populations, and so it has created this antipathy towards conservation. And therefore, becoming very
I'm sorry, sir, to interrupt you. I think you're on mute, like just now. I think just went on mute. Just have to unmute yourself.
not sure how that happened. Hello?
Yeah. I think somebody muted you. I request all the participants, please do not do that. Anyone, whoever did that, please don't do that again. Sorry, sir.
No
Please
problem. Well,
continue.
what did you, was that just now?
Yeah, just now. Like maybe we missed 2 words of whatever you were
Okay,
saying.
fine. Yeah. So anyway, I think I was just saying that sea turtles are bigger picture here is sea turtles are flagships for ecosystems, coral reefs and seagrass beds, open oceans, reef fish and other communities. And we have to keep our, the bigger picture in mind and focus on the conservation of coastal and marine ecosystems as a whole, and not become too focused on individual sea turtle species, which which can perhaps which can and has had detrimental impacts at a larger scale. And while I'm saying that, I would say that the same is true for other flagship species as well, such as tigers and elephants and so on. And as long as we're using them to achieve a larger goal, that works very well. But becoming obsessed with single species can in fact have perverse or negative consequences for conservation. Thank you. That's it. I'd be happy to take questions, and I will also leave you with my slide of my books and my website, which of course you can access for any more information that you would like.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk, Kartik. There are a number of questions that have been typed in.
Yes, sir.
Probably Raksha can read them out.
Yes, sir. I'll do that.
To discuss them, okay?
Sure.
Okay, sir. The first question is by Sachin K. What is the impact observed in leatherback turtles of pollution and human interference? I think
that would be the difference. Let me stop presenting.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So specifically for leatherback turtles, I'm not. I wouldn't. I don't think there've been studies on that, but in general, pollution has been found to cause. It has been implicated in this disease called fibropapillomatosis particularly in green turtles. And it's essentially like a tumor that forms on their heads and other parts of their body, flippers and so on. And there's been some impact of both warming, warm waters, as well as pollution on it, even though it's caused by a virus. So there's also specifically there's been work on pollution on turtle eggs. So there's been work on like different sort of loads of heavy metals and so on. I don't think there's enough. I mean, I can point you to some more literature on that specifically. It's not something that I'm overly familiar with the details of. But very broadly speaking, I think both onshore and offshore pollution have been implicated in negative impacts on sea turtle populations. And there's some very obvious ones. I mean, there's oil spills and like oil spills on nesting beaches and so on. But I think that sometimes some of the subtle effects might be more widespread, but they're also harder to study and need longer to sort of like assess.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is by Industry. Her question is, there are several researches now which show that at present there are several threats that the olive ridley are facing due to human activities like exploitation. Can you shed light on how conservation is managed now to save these species?
So, as I was saying, actually now worldwide, like they found that a large number of sea turtle populations have actually like recovered and are increasing. The greater threats to these populations seem to be from actually from things like coastal development and so on. In a way, globally, uh, thanks to in India, we have a very protectionist model. We don't like to promote any sustainable use. Uh, Globally, the movement has been dominated by American conservationists who have also sort of pushed for complete protection. But the best today, the most I think the most stable olive ridley population is in Ostinal in Costa Rica, where there is a legal harvest of eggs. Uh, in many other communities worldwide, where there was either voluntary or like a forced, banning of the take of meat and eggs, populations have just increased madly. In fact, in the last international symposium 2 years ago, we had a panel discussion on beyond protection of sea turtles, and we said, and many people said we stopped utilization of turtles because we claimed that the populations were all on the verge of extinction. They are not now. We need to reevaluate, our view of conservation of these species. And in many instances, you can have local community, maybe not in India. I mean, in India also, there are many places where people consume sea turtle eggs. But many parts of the world, for people to conserve resources, those resources meant something to them. People had like the Bermuda 1620 Assembly, right? They used those resources and they wanted to conserve them because it was part of their life. So in fact, I would say, how should conservation be managed to save these species? I would say in a multifaceted way. There are certain places where conservation can be benefited by sustainable use. We must be open to that. And they are not on the verge of extinction in most places. Some populations, yes, and those must be managed like very, critically, with absolute protection, but that actually does not apply to a very, very large number of populations worldwide. And being open to different kinds of conservation approaches is something that I've been trying to push very hard.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is by Ayudh Wagle. Can you suggest good institutions in India that work on turtle and their conservation?
All of those NGOs that I mentioned, actually, they're all local NGOs. If you go to we have a website called seaturtlesofindia.org. Whichever state you're in, you will find one or two NGOs nearby. The NGO that I'm associated with, the Dakshin Foundation, has long-term programs in Orissa, Lakshadweep, and Andamans, and we also coordinate the Turtle Action Group. So we work at a national level through the network, and also at specific sites where we have our own research and conservation programs. And there are other NGOs as well, that large NGOs that have conservation programs.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next question is by Tejaswini Singh. As we know that the survival rate of the turtles are very low, is there any conservational measures we can take to increase the survival rate?
This is actually this is a good question. I mean, so in the 70s, in the US, they said that, like, look, the mortality rate is highest when the turtles hatchlings are small, and so let's like grow them to a certain size and release them. It was called head starting, and they did this for Kemp's ridleys primarily because it was the population had like crashed so much. But then they realized that there might be a lot of things to do with imprinting that goes on at a particular stage of their life, which might affect their ability to remigrate. So head starting as a strategy was stopped then. 30 years later, some of the ridleys Kemp's ridleys that they released appear to be coming back to nest. I think they used some tagging. Well, tagging hatchlings is very, very difficult. But I think they used they tried skin grafts and things like that. Some tagging methods have worked a little bit. It's taken 30 years to show results. But I think there is some reevaluation of head starting now. But on the whole, most sea turtle biologists believe that survival rate is something that needs to be left to nature. So what we have to do is protect the nesting beaches, allow them to come and nest, and millions of hatchlings will go out into the water. Some 1 in 10,000 will survive, and that is sufficient to keep the population, to sustain the population. Perhaps that even head starting might be interfering with ecosystem processes in a way that we might not want to do.
Thank you. So next question is by me. What effects would sea level rise have on the life cycle pattern of the sea turtles? Has there been any observed adaptations that the turtles have taken up as a response to the changes that have already taken place?
Sorry, could you?
Yeah, do I repeat it? Okay.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So what effects would sea level rise have on the life cycle pattern of sea turtles, and have there been any observed adaptations that the turtle have already taken up as a response?
So I don't think turtles are going to be able to adapt except in ways that are sort of within their repertoire already, which is that they can seek new nesting beaches. They know how to do that, but probably not at very large spatial scales. I think sea level rise directly would the immediate impact would be the loss of nesting beaches, and as I said before, on the mainland, the prospect of moving a little bit along the coast, 10 kilometers, 20, 30, 40 kilometers up and down the coast is not too difficult. But when beaches on islands start to disappear, I think it might be we don't actually know how turtles will respond to that, but the likelihood that they'll be able to find alternate beaches could be quite small. And that would definitely have some very severe impacts on sea turtle populations. Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. Next one is again by Ayud Wagle. Can you suggest some good books related to turtles, tortoises, and terrapins?
Read my book, Ayud. No. So the funny thing about sea turtle biologists is that like people like me, we may work on other herpetofauna, but for some reason there's a very small subset of sea turtle people that also work on freshwater turtles. I mean, there's just a handful of such people that come to my mind. We tend to be very sea turtle obsessed to a degree, so I can't profess to tell you much about tortoises and terrapins, but certainly for sea turtles, Archie Carr's. If you want to read about the history of sea turtles, the Archie Carr's book is a classic. There's more seriously, my book is about the history of sea turtle conservation in India. About sea turtle biology, there's a series called The Biology of Sea Turtles. They're a bit expensive, but like there's no better reference material for knowing about the biology of sea turtles. There are, I think, 3 volumes now. And those are absolutely like it's kind of our Bible for like the state of knowledge about sea turtles.
Okay, the next question is by Sachin again. Is there change in feeding according to the habitat?
So sea turtles tend to, all species are omnivorous when they're hatchlings and juveniles, and then they tend to go into these specialized adult feeding modes. So they don't change feeding by habitat, but it's actually there's an ontogenic shift, and in most species that's kind of carnivorous. It's a carnivorous shift. So loggerheads and the ridleys, for example, tend to be fairly diverse. They will eat fish and crabs, and loggerheads, in fact, like have those big crushing jaws. So crustaceans, mollusks, fish, and so on. Leatherbacks specialize on jellyfish as adults. Hawksbills, as I said, specialize on sponges. They're spongivorous. It's been likened to eating glass because sponges have a silicaceous skeleton. And green turtles have the most remarkable shift. They shift to complete herbivory. And stable isotope studies that have looked at sort of the stages of growth show this clear sort of trend from a carnivorous diet to a herbivorous diet at one stage in their life cycle. So they move to nearshore habitats as juveniles, and then they find these seagrass beds and they become completely herbivorous. which has two impacts. One is that they're much more slow growing and late maturing, so the estimates are that they may take 30 to 50 years to mature. And the other is that they're just like they're literally like pests in areas where there are seagrass meadows, and they have these devastating impacts on seagrass ecosystems in much the same way that elephants have in African savannas. So they're not necessarily very popular.
Okay, so next one is again by industry. Are there any changes in the nesting behavior of these turtles in the beaches of Odisha and those in Mexico and other places where they're known to nest?
Not really. I mean, the nesting patterns the nesting behaviors are very similar. But arribadas seem to come about when, when populations increase in size and turtles, like as groups, find new beaches to nest at. So from 20 years ago, when globally, olive ridleys were also considered to be, highly endangered. Today, like I said, in Costa Rica, it's quite interesting. There's Ostional, which is a beach where there's actually sustainable use of eggs. The population has increased. Nancite, which has complete protection. The olive ridleys have completely stopped nesting over there. And there's a new nesting site in the southern part of Costa Rica. There are new nesting sites in Guatemala and I think in either Nicaragua or Panama. So new nesting beaches that have been coming up. At the same time, where 20 years ago, the nesting beaches, arribada beaches had disappeared. And in India, Devi River mouth in Rushikulya has not had nesting for 25 years, but nesting in Rushikulya has gone up. And there's a new mass nesting beach for olive ridley turtles in the Andamans, where about 5 to 10,000 turtles have been nesting each year for the last 7 or 8 years. And this was not known of before at all. So yes, the changes are just in terms of, as the populations increase, I think new nesting beaches pop up. But other than that, no changes in the behavior as such.
Okay, sir. So next one is by Giri Murugan. He asks, sir, do the geomagnetic reversal, that is reversal of magnetic poles of Earth, and the weakening of magnetic strength of Earth have any effect on turtle life cycle?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I mean, turtles are believed to use both the magnetic field orientation as well as the magnetic field intensity to navigate. So I imagine that that both a reversal as well as a weakening could have an effect on turtle migrations. The lab that has done the most research, on sea turtle on navigation using magnetic orientation is Ken Lohman's lab at the University of North Carolina, UNC. And there's just a huge body of work from the lab over the last 20, 25 years, including a number of Nature and Science papers. This is a question I'm going to go look it up myself. I'm not sure if we actually, based logically on their on their behavior, I would imagine that these would have effects on them. I'm not sure if they've specifically tested this.
Thank you, sir. Next,
can I come in on that point?
Please.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
the time scales are quite different. The time scales of magnetic reversals have apparently, if I understand it right, I am not an expert on that. What I have read is that it is of the order of decades.
Yeah.
Within decades, whereas turtle life cycles are considerably longer, several decades longer than the time it takes for magnetic cycles to reverse. So probably they live long enough to adapt. Is my guess it would be that. The time scales you need to be worried about.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I mean, I'm like I said, it's, it might even have been in a paper that I read some years ago and I might have just forgotten it. So, I mean, look up Lohman's work and I'm sure you will you'll find an answer to your question.
Thank you, sir. Next one is by Amrita Jaiprakash. So how can the heat waves in ocean and sea acidification affect the marine organisms like sea turtles?
I think again, in terms of some of these effects are not direct, but these could, many of these could affect the thermal ecology because as ectotherms They have to they do move in areas where the temperatures are conducive to them. So if you look at where they sort of like migrate, even in the Bay of Bengal, they seem to follow certain isotherms in terms of temperature. So if there is a changing pattern of sea surface temperature, that is going to affect their distribution, which is going to affect their access to resources. And then, of course, acidification and ocean warming is going to lead to a change in the resources available itself. And that, I think, some of these indirect impacts are probably like even more likely to affect these organisms than the direct impacts.
Sorry, I was on mute. Next question is by Ansa. Hello, sir. As the turtles travel thousands of kilometers during migration, how do the females and hatchlings cope with the temperature difference during migration?
So sea turtles can operate within a fair range of temperature. One of the remarkable things, about leatherback turtles in particular, is that they actually can thermoregulate to a certain degree. And they have been known to maintain the body temperature at 15, 20 degrees above the surrounding water using a combination of physiological mechanisms. They have this very remarkable thing called countercurrent blood flow, which sort of circulates warm blood back into the body and keep the cold blood to the flippers. Now, this is only for leatherback turtles, and that allows them actually to range in colder waters in search of jellyfish and even dive very deep in search of jellyfish. The other sea turtles and hatchlings actually thermoregulate more by distribution, so they remain in waters which are optimal for them. And in fact, in many parts of the world, in the northern Atlantic, for example, the ocean currents often like sweep turtles into the colder waters, and sometimes when you get these cold waves, these turtles get cold stunned, and sometimes they get hundreds and thousands of cold stunned turtles that they then have to sort of rescue off the coast of northern Carolina and even off the coast of New York and so on. So if they by chance they swept into waters that are too cold for them, they will get cold stunned. If they aren't rescued, they will die unless they sort of swept back by chance into warmer waters. Hatchlings that are in water that's not conducive to them in terms of temperature will get eaten as part of the trophic ecology of marine ecosystems, the food chain.
Yeah. The next question is from Amrita again. Sir, are there any mutualism interactions connected with sea turtles?
That's a good question. So, I'm not so sure. I wouldn't call it. No, I can't think of anything that I would call a mutualism necessarily. Marine ecosystems are just full of like these mutualism stories, right? But I'm with sea turtles, I'm not actually like again a good question that I don't. But off the top of my head, I can't think of anything that I would actually call a necessarily call a mutualism. No. But if I'm wrong, I mean I could be wrong. I mean, if we, I'm sure if we Google that, we might find something to do with it. I would encourage you to look it up yourself. But I really, there are commensalistic relationships with things that, barnacles and other animals that like live attached to turtle shells. And there might be indirect benefits related to sea turtles that, with, perhaps fish following them around and so on. But like a very specific mutualism doesn't come to my mind.
Okay, so next question is by Pradeep. He says, Sir, I'm a fisherman as well as a researcher. Can you tell me what is a good way to involve the local fishermen in turtle conservation? Sorry.
I love that. I mean, I think that like, fishermen are the people who are out at sea, and in terms of monitoring sort of offshore populations of turtles, being involved in ensuring that there is not bycatch of turtles in nets, minimizing the amount of bycatch of turtles in nets. These are all ways in which fishermen can be involved in turtle conservation. As I said before, I think our larger goal needs to be the conservation of the marine ecosystem. And maybe I didn't make this very clear, but when I say conservation of the marine ecosystem, for me that includes local communities and fishing. So I think a sustainable fishery and a healthy marine system is important both for conservation as well as for a healthy fishery as well as for healthy coastal communities. So I think all of these are very strongly interrelated, and we need to find ways to work together to make sure that can happen. I would encourage you, Pradeep, to either get in. I'm not sure which part of the coast you are from, but either get in touch with one of the local groups who's working over there, or you're more than welcome to get in touch with us at Dakshin, and we can connect you depending on where you are. We need more fishermen to be involved in this dialogue with conservation. So thanks for that.
Thank you, sir. Next question is by Harini. She asks, there are studies being carried out on sea turtles and reptiles in general. Are studies on marine mammals carried out extensively by biologists? And I guess it's not very popular. What are the challenges regarding marine mammal conservation studies, especially whales?
It's not that it's unpopular. In fact, on the whole, mammals are more popular than reptiles, and marine mammals also attract attention. But the challenge in India, I'll start with the challenge. The challenge is that for good marine mammal studies, you actually need a lot of resources, right? You need boats to go out and ships actually to go out and conduct surveys. You need a lot of or you need a lot of, or you need a lot of high-tech equipment, and so most of the studies in India have tended to be sort of like have been coastline-based surveys. There've been a few water-based surveys, but that it's mostly like studies of standing records. There's some genetic studies that are ongoing. There's quite an active group actually. There are several people that have done their PhDs on marine mammals in India. Two of them, Dipani Sutaria and Coralie D'Souza, worked on on the Chilka dolphin in Chilka. And they're both marine mammal experts, and they both lead marine mammal programs. Dipani is an independent researcher. Coralie is with WWF in Goa. And there's several younger researchers. There's Mihir Sule, who's doing marine mammal genetics at my department right now. Ketki Jog, with whom he's worked with for a long time. They've both worked on Maharashtra. Divya Panikar has worked on marine mammals in Lakshadweep. And there's probably a couple of others that I'm forgetting. But it's quite it's a small, but it's a very active group. And I think they would be, excited to have other young people sort of be interested in marine mammal research.
Thank you, sir. I think this is the question by Mayank Shukla. Is there long-term ecological data, population and distribution available for marine turtles in India?
Yes. I mean, in fact, I would say that it's one of the groups for which we probably have the most data. The baseline surveys starting with the baseline surveys that Satish Bhaskar did in from the 70s to the 90s. Between 99 and 2001, when I was at Wildlife Institute of India, B.C. Chowdhury led a national UNDP-funded project which surveyed all of the coastal states. So we have a baseline for all coastal states from about 2000, 2001. We then also have the citizens groups data from all of these states from whenever those groups started, some in the 80s, some in the 90s, some in the 2000s. So many of these states have local data based on the local groups over there. And then my research program has been doing long-term population monitoring for ridleys in Orissa since the mid-2000s, leatherbacks in Andaman since about 2008. But that again combines with the Crocbanks data from the 90s and 2000s, and then in the Lakshadweep as well for the last 10 years. So we have long-term data sets that we're directly involved in that for about 10 to 15 years, and then there's data that other people collected that provide baselines from much earlier. So there actually is excellent data on marine turtles, all of which is on, not all of the data, but information about all of this is on the Sea Turtles of India website. So I encourage you to look for more details there.
So that was the last question in the chat box, but I have one last question for you before maybe we can end this. So my question is: you've clearly know, like, believe in science communication by all your writings and your books and even current conservation. I just want to ask you, what role or what importance do you think it has, and what are the changes that you felt since you've started writing and everything? Because I feel at the end of the day, until unless we've involved everybody and looking at it from all directions and not just in a one directional perspective, conservation is not going to be successful. So what are your views on the importance of science communication?
Thanks, Raksha. I think that's a good way to sort of round this out. For too long, I think conservation has been the domain of biologists. It's a very arrogant, self-centered perspective that was pioneered, unfortunately, by very well-known and well-respected people like Michael Soule, E.O. Wilson, and others. And I mean, Wilson, to be fair, also wrote for the public, but believed largely that conservation decisions should be made by biology. And I think it's a narrow and authoritarian and very arrogant view. So we've been in many of our own sort of work. We've been very critical of that in a couple of different ways. I mean, I think firstly that science is much broader than ecology, and if you want, and conservation is as much about people as it is about animals. In fact, it's much more about people because it's about what people do. For the most part, nature can look after itself, despite what we might Dan Brockington and I might say in our Shockington avatar. What really needs to be managed is people, and ecology can't manage people. It is the science of management and the social sciences that really give us insights into how to manage people and politics and economics and so on. And so I think the role that social science plays in conservation, even though that has entered the framework in the last decade and a half, it still does not get as much importance as it needs, right? The second part of the social that you raised in a sense, and is that it's not again about some great scientific insight that some biologist got that then you tell the government and they implement it. It's really about every citizen internalizing sort of what they can do for the environment, and without without narrowing it to a particular view of the world, right? So you read articles all the time by people that are urban conservationists who are always like decrying like people for for communities for collecting firewood or for being poachers or whatever it is. But everything is a entirely, for me, a justifiable lifestyle as long as we can find a balance to it, right? And for that reason, I think that citizen science is important for us, not just to reach society, but to reach all facets of society, right? Most of the, unfortunately, I don't consider my writing to be in English to be very, I do it because I enjoy it, and I hope I reach students like people over here. But in the end, I'm reaching an English-speaking audience. And that, to me, that just is not sufficient. So I think of the work that we do with Dakshin, for example, that we work with communities along the coast. We set up community monitoring programs so that they can monitor their own resources, that that they can engage with us and with even with the state, in a language, in a common language. Let's in the language of science, let's say, that they can be on the same platform. This is very important. That when we say, yeah, communication, absolutely, you're absolutely right. Communicating science is important. But communicating is important in a sense that when you say communicating science, is almost like I am telling you what I know, right? Sharing has to be we will not conserve this planet if we don't understand each other, right? So change that a little bit and say that I really believe in not just in science communication, but in the idea of communication. And in that, I think we have to learn to become better listeners. Is I think absolutely central and critical to achieving our larger goals.
Thank you, Kartik. It was a great session, interactive session. It was wonderful to have you with us. I think the students and very wide audience benefited greatly from your knowledge base.
Thank you.
So I'm sure you will have a lot of queries coming your way from the kids.
Happy to
Thank
have
you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you all
Uh,
so much for inviting me. Great
Thank
pleasure
you.
to meet some of you again. And yeah, great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank
Good
you.
afternoon. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you